Let me get this program started. Good morning and welcome to Rhode Island on a virtual panel discussion on this beautiful day. I'm Ron Makeley, president of Bryant University, at least until July 1, when I'll retire after 24 years. But on behalf of everyone at Bryant and Neil Steinberg, president of Rhode Island Foundation, I want to thank all of you who are joining this important discussion, as well as our panelists who will be presenting information on the pandemic economics. What does it mean for Rhode Island? And I particularly want to thank our professor, Dr. Eddie Tibaldi, who is a distinguished economist, for organizing this intellectual and very important discussion so that Rhode Island can in fact recover from this pandemic. The focus for today's panel is public finances in Rhode Island. We're extremely pleased and proud to convene this distinguished group of experts to provide perspective, insight, and guidance as we all navigate through this difficult challenge we face as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. As a retired Navy captain, I'd use the analogy, we're in uncharted waters with swells of 40 to 75 feet. So we have a lot to cover, and let's get started, and I'd like to introduce our moderator, Margie O'Brien. Some of you may recognize Margie O'Brien from Governor Raimondo's daily press briefings, where she assisted in getting information on the COVID crisis out to Rhode Islanders. Others know her as a distinguished journalist who has been telling stories for more than 25 years as an award-winning news reporter and anchor. Her best change in 2015, her beat changed in 2015 when she became the person who was covering Rhode Island legislature and political news as host of Rhode Island Capital TV. She earned her bachelor's degree from St. Anselm's College and her master's degree from Emerson College. She's a graduate of Leadership Rhode Island and sits on the board of the organization's Women's Network. Thank you, Margie, for being the moderator, and I'll turn the program over to you so you can introduce our distinguished panelists.
Good morning, President Makeley, and congratulations and best wishes on your upcoming retirement.
Thank you
to everyone here this morning, thanks so much for being here. We have a full packed hour for you, and we hope that we finish just as the sun is breaking through the crowds. We also wanted to thank Bryant University and Rhode Island Foundation for inviting me to be the moderator and also hosting the second panel in the series of virtual panels, Pandemic Economics and What It Means for Rhode Island. The objective of this series of panels is to help Rhode Islanders better understand the impact of COVID-19 on the state economy and how leaders can calibrate their policy responses accordingly. Now, the focus for today's panel is public finances in Rhode Island, and I'm pretty sure I just heard either a deep breath or a loud gasp from most of the people. So we know we're dealing with a very serious topic right here. Before we begin our discussion, I just wanted to give you an overview of how things will go this morning. We will begin with an introduction of the panelists. Now, to be mindful of the time, you did all receive their full bios, so I'll just give a short intro to all of our panelists this morning. And then we'll have what we believe to be will be a rich and informative discussion. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the program. And so during the course of the program, if you have something that you would like to ask, you can write this down in the chat room. And Bryant University Professor of Economics and lead organizer of this panelist, Edinaldo Tibaldi, will be gathering your questions, and we will try to answer as many as possible. So now I have the honor of introducing some of our region's most accomplished and distinguished experts in this field. Let's begin with Jeffrey Thompson. Jeffrey is an economist and vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston's New England Public Policy Center. So he'll be able to talk to what's happening all over New England. As chief of the Office of Revenue Analysis, Paul Dion leads a staff of 5 economists responsible for the analysis, evaluation, and appraisal of the state's tax system. Now, Paul, I believe that you may have crossed paths with Jeffrey as you are a member of the New England Public Policy Center Advisory Board for the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Michael DeBiase began serving as president.
That is correct.
Oh, I'd love to have some responses here. So one thing I will say is I miss the full packed room of smiling faces and people just nodding. So feel free just to jump in this morning. Michael, let's get to you. Michael DeBiase began serving as president and CEO of the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council in just January of this year. He previously served as the director of administration for the state of Rhode Island. And last but not least, Gary Sass is the founding director of the Hassenfield Institute for Public Leadership at Bryant University. His background includes a variety of roles as an advisor and consultant in both the public and private sectors. So I wanted to begin this morning with a quote from Governor Gina Raimondo that many may agree with and certainly sets the stage for our discussion this morning. She said earlier this week, if we don't get more money from Congress, everything is on the table. The choices we'd have to make would just be unprecedented. So let's begin there. Jeffrey, can I ask you the first question? COVID-19 caused an unprecedented decline in economic activity and tax revenues. Could you please talk about the Fed's projections of the impact of COVID-19 on the state tax revenues across New England?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I'm going to share with the participants some slides that we put together, and I'll talk through them briefly, covering a little bit of economic background briefly, and then talk about our revenue forecasts. So I'm going to share my screen and grab onto this PDF file. Hopefully people can see that, and I will make it full screen, so hopefully everyone can hear me. Margie, can people see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm sharing results from a larger slide deck that's available at bostonfed.org, so please go check it out. My colleagues and I put this together some weeks back, but we've been updating it regularly. So as everyone knows, as COVID-19 hit the region and the rest of the country, the region's economy shut down. So here I'm showing daily new cases. So we spiked, the virus started to really take hold mid-March, spiked sort of second half of April, and has been trending down since that time. But during the period of the rapid spread, early phase of the rapid spread of the virus, the economy went into shutdown mode. So this is a crowded slide, but it essentially shows three main sectors and how they shut down really severely. On the far right-hand side, restaurant reservations across the country and across the region essentially closed entirely. So restaurants were completely shut down by the middle of March. Air traffic out of Logan started to decline sharply mid-March, was basically shut down completely at the end of the month. Similar story for hotel occupancy around Boston. So as the economy was shut down, both by public order and by private decisions, firms also decided to close voluntarily, and people start not wanting to catch the virus, decided to stay home. The economy shut down, and that of course led to a massive spike in unemployment insurance claims. And this slide shows UI new initial claims indexed to the worst week of the Great Recession back in 2008 and 9. And what we saw is that in March 21st, that first week when UI claims started to roll in New England, we had shot up to being 10 times higher than things ever had gotten, worse than they had ever gotten at the worst point of the Great Recession. And that's tapered off somewhat as the initial shock has faded, but UI claims have still continued to mount, such that now across the region, we now have 1.8 million people receiving unemployment insurance and 35 million people nationwide. And when you express those UI claims as a share of the labor force to give a sense for how extreme the unemployment situation is, we see this slide. So this is all 50 states, and in red on the left-hand side, you see Rhode Island. At one point, some weeks back, Rhode Island was the highest or the second highest state. Georgia, Kentucky, and Michigan have since surpassed Rhode Island. So, but we do see that more than 35% of the labor force in Rhode Island, or UI claims represent 35% of the total labor force. For the region more broadly, it's 24%. So unemployment has spread quite widely. And the broad-based shutdown in economic activity with employment, income, consumption, tourism being completely shut down. 4 of the 10 states in New England are in the top 10 4 of New England's 6 states are in the top 10 for reliance on tourism in the economy. So with shutting down the economy, essentially closing most of the streams of revenue to state governments has resulted in very steep revenue losses. And I'm showing you a table now that shows essentially the results of the forecast, which are quite stark. You see large dollar declines for Rhode Island. We see our low unemployment scenario projects a revenue decline of $400 million in fiscal year 2020 compared to 2019. Our high unemployment scenario is not just a little bit worse at $464 million decline. And I want to make clear what this represents because if you represent a forecast of revenue, combines 2 things. It combines how high you think unemployment will rise, and it also combines, or generally how bad you think the economy is going to get, but also how the fiscal system interacts with the economy. So we're not trying to break new ground here on the unemployment forecast. We do rely on, the numbers here are based on us expecting that unemployment in Rhode Island and specifically will reach 21.7% in Q2 in our low case, 24.7% in our high case. But really what we're trying to contribute to the conversation with our forecasts is trying to share with the states a simple, replicable, easy replicable method for revenue forecasting. And that will be shared publicly in coming weeks in the form of a current policies perspectives paper from the Boston Fed. But the reason we put out our forecast is that there were a host of forecasts had been produced, each having quite a bit of variation in the projected revenue losses, not being very clear on what the methodologies were, some being proprietary forecasts produced by consulting firms, other people relying on rules of thumb that may or may not be very helpful. So our model, produced by a team member of mine, Bo Zhao, is a simple model that relies on unemployment levels, the unemployment rate in levels, and a time trend and a quadratic of the time trend, so the time trend squared. It's a very simple econometric method that can be replicated, and we're going to be sharing these details with revenue forecasters. And I think so the results are quite depressing in terms of the steepness of the revenue losses. But we've found that the model actually has a fairly high predictive power. In the case of Rhode Island, the model essentially accounts for more than 90% of the variation over time in state revenues. So we're not including here local taxes, we're not including property taxes, and we're also not this is not a budget forecast because we're not accounting for, increased needs in any expenditures or the presence of reserve funds and rainy day funds. This is just a revenue forecast. But hopefully it's a useful contribution to the conversation for budget makers and policy makers. And as you can see, obviously the slide contains information on other states across the region. Some states hit somewhat less. Vermont, for example, not hit very hard. Connecticut looking like it's facing steep losses. But the model is quite good for Rhode Island and Massachusetts and Vermont. The other states, it doesn't do as good of a job of predicting changes. But I think I'm probably running at the end of my time. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and hand back control to you, Margie. So hopefully that was helpful.
It was. Thank you so much. And thanks for the broader picture. I do want to get a little more focus now on the Rhode Island picture. And if you've watched the House or Senate Finance Committees on Capitol TV, it's a little plug for Capitol TV, you know that it is a dire situation in Rhode Island right now. Paul Diane, I'd like to ask you to help us dive into the Rhode Island budget. And as we all know, it's a deep dive. The Fed's budget gap projections are frankly quite dismal. Can you provide your own assessment of the financial implications to the state of Rhode Island? Specifically, how do we balance this budget? We're already looking at a huge deficit for this fiscal year and a greater one for next fiscal year. What do we do in Rhode Island?
Thank you, Margie. I just want to start by saying anything I say and during this broadcast does not necessarily represent the views of the Raimondo administration. And I just want to get that out front. That's my big caveat of every talk I ever give. I have nothing to share on screen, but for those who are watching, you can at least look at my Clash poster in the back of my head there. So how do we solve FY20? Well, there's not a lot of time, obviously. The May Revenue Estimating Conference just ended on May 8th, giving us approximately 7 weeks. Realistically, you are not going to be able to do too many things on the revenue or cost side in that relatively short period of time. Obviously, spending will be constrained, if not halted in its tracks. There's a hiring freeze in place. There is some hope that revenues will come in better than the forecast that was adopted at the May Revenue Estimating Conference. And we have some preliminary indication that that is in fact the case for at least some of our revenue items. Basically, we also have the we wish it was 100 billion, $1.25 billion of federal stimulus money available. So as much expenses as possible will be shifted to those sources for payment. And then push comes to shove, we do have access to the Budget Reserve Fund, which we think is approximately $197 to $200 million right now. That would be something you could draw on in FY20, but it would have to be repaid in FY 2021. So that's, in short term, there's a few things you can do essentially around the margins for FY20. The bigger issue is FY21. You have far more flexibility in FY21. The deficit is significantly larger, $515 million in general revenue. And in that case, you can look at substantive enhancements, cost reductions, which could include, as the governor, I think, has said, everything's on the table, could include furloughs, layoffs, et cetera. Also an expectation, or I have an expectation, maybe it's really a hope, but an expectation that there'll be some federal, some federal monies coming forward. I think even Senator McConnell, Senate leader, has said that they would meet and talk about that. And again, in reference to Jeff's slides, we saw these huge spikes in unemployment. There is some that if things can open up without a snapback in the infection rate, et cetera, that we would be able to see a quicker recovery from the downturn than, for example, that we saw during the great financial crisis of 2009 through 2011. So more flexibility in 2021, much more limited in 2020.
Paul, thanks very much. We're going to get to more of the federal discussion in our second part of the panel, but I wanted to stay right on the state right now. And Michael DeBiase, as you know, the legislature has not met since March 12th. It's been very quiet over there at the State House. How should the legislature approach this budget crisis? And really, what should the priority be right now?
Well, Margie, thank you for the easy question. They have a really hard job ahead of them. I think the legislature needs to be clear on the difference between one-time expenditures to deal with the pandemic and the aftermath and our regular rate of state spending. As a state, although we balance the budget each year, our future spending commitments are consistently more than our available revenues. Because of this, we think it's normal every year to face a budget deficit, even though we have increasing revenues in an expanding economy. So I think the legislature needs to reduce our recurring expenditures in the next fiscal year because I don't think they're likely to rebound for a while. The economists seem to think that this is not going to be a snapback recovery, that this is going to be a persistent problems in the economy. So I think we need to prepare ourselves that we're not going to get back to even the current year level very quickly. So while we need to use the federal funds to fill the budget gaps, we need to recognize that that federal funding is one time and we shouldn't rely on it to expand our level of spending. And in terms of priorities, first thing, what a good thing is that the federal government is essentially funding all of our response costs. So the state does not have to step up and spend in that area. And that's a huge amount of money. I think the governor's office said $600 million already in those types of expenses. Second, I think we need to do our best to maintain essential social services, income support, food, housing, other social services to those in need, including those most affected by the crisis. We have a lot of people in Rhode Island, a lot of Rhode Islanders that have fallen through the cracks, and there's going to be more people in need when the federal supports run out. So we got to be prepared for that. I think third, we need to protect the progress we made in making the state more competitive. We did have a low unemployment rate before the pandemic, but the pandemic has reinforced that we're still dependent on a lot of low-wage service jobs. And Professor Topaldi has pointed that out in one of his recent studies. So we need to avoid the temptation to raise taxes on businesses and business owners. Now is the time to attract business. And then the last point I would make is, and this is maybe the most important, is we need to prioritize our one-time federal funding and maybe borrow state money to invest in quickly recovering. So we need to, and time is of the essence here, we need to make investments to get workers and businesses back on their feet. So we need to invest more in economic development and job training, but we need to reassess whether our economic development programs are the right ones, whether we need more than the Real Jobs program now, are our bond issues the right ones? So I think we need to step back and ask, are all these things going to help us recover quickly and accelerate the recovery? So,
Michael, can I ask a quick follow-up question? The governor has said that there is nothing off the table as far as helping to balance the budget. But does it make sense to furlough state employees? Wouldn't these folks just be looking to the unemployment money?
Well, obviously you don't want to add to the problem of people being unemployed. However, we have a lot of private businesses and nonprofits in Rhode Islanders that are out of work. So the idea that one of our highest priorities should be to maintain state employment is not something I would agree with. I think government also needs to reinvent itself, make itself more efficient, and I don't think Rhode Islanders would necessarily support the fact that state employees are the ones whose jobs are going to be maintained while there's so many other people who've lost their jobs.
Thank you. Gary Sass, we all know there is a trickle-down effect with all of this. Could you talk about how the pandemic will impact the towns and municipalities of Rhode Island? And also, if you could touch on whether the feds have a role in hoping to mitigate sort of this gloomy budget crisis?
Well, I'll answer your second question first. The feds do have a role, a very important role. And there are two pieces of legislation that are being considered by the Congress. One I've been involved with, and it's the State and Municipal Assistance and Recovery Act. We call it the SMART Act. It's a bipartisan bill. It's sponsored by 50 people in the House, 25 Republicans, 25 Democrats. And it also was simultaneously introduced in the Senate by a Democrat, Senator Menendez of New Jersey and Senator Cassidy of Louisiana. There's also another bill that's equally as good, and that's by Senator Jack Reed. It's the State and Local Emergency Stabilization Act. And it has advantages. Distribution of the money in Senator Reed's Act has some advantages for Rhode Island. They're both very good bills. They will serve, I think, as the basis to reach bipartisan agreement. Not as ambitious as the Democrats in the House want, but certainly substantial. As far as federal aid is concerned, if it's not forthcoming, the impact will be catastrophic for Rhode Island cities and towns. And it'll be catastrophic for a number of years. It's not a one-time event. Part of that is driven by some structural problems which have existed in Rhode Island for a long time in terms of intergovernmental fiscal relations. Rhode Island cities and towns are over-reliant on property taxes, more than cities and towns in most places. They get about 90% of their own source revenue from the property tax. So any change there obviously has an impact. And if you look at total state local revenue, property taxes are about 45 cents on the dollar, whereas state revenue, which are the income tax, business taxes, sales tax, are about 32 cents on the dollar. So there's a structural problem built in, and if communities are hurt, the property tax doesn't give them much leeway. The second structural problem is that the state is underfunded its share of education. Nationally, states contribute about 47 cents of every dollar spent for schools. In Rhode Island, the figure is closer to 40 cents. And so with those two problems, you have something to overcome. The other problem, which will affect the economy and communities, the Lincoln Land Institute, it does a study periodically looking at tax burdens, property tax burdens by different classes of taxpayers. And when they looked at the largest city in each state, they found that Providence's commercial and industrial property taxes were the fourth highest in the nation. Following Detroit, and Boston was way below us. And so as the pandemic affects the economy, what I think you're going to see as a result of the property tax overdependent is an insufficient state support for education, is foreclosures, evictions, bankruptcies, and that will not only reduce property tax yields, but because residential property values will hold up better and be more stable, it'll reflect a political shifting onto residences. And with high unemployment, that creates problems as well. And so you'll end up with worst case scenario, and this is really worst case, if businesses fail to pay mortgages, landlords fail to pay mortgages, businesses fail to pay rents, you begin to get liquidity problems because the institutions then won't have enough money to address some of the other needs that both small businesses in the state will have, which kind of rolls through to the government. So their communities are facing a problem, some of it I think worse than many other places in the country because of the structural issues that I just identified. And so the question I think then comes, and I'll conclude with this, is what do you do about it? It's easy to describe a problem. It's hard to discuss what to do. And there's an opportunity here, building on some things Mike has said. Local governments spend most of their money by rules established by the General Assembly and by the governor. And so you need to go back in and look at the rules of the game that are driving municipal costs. A couple of years ago, an evergreen contract provision was passed, which municipalities and the school committees opposed, but there are many more rules of the road. So if you want to control spending, and you can't solve this problem just on either the revenue or the spending side of the equation, you got to look at what you require cities to do and towns to do and school committees to do. And this is an opportunity to modernize the whole intergovernmental fiscal relationship. The second thing is be aware of fool's gold. There are a lot of people who would say that we can save money by regionalization and consolidation. There are ways to reduce costs. Possibly. It'll take a long time. And you have to understand the economies of scale. So look at that really closely. The third issue is, I've spoken about what you can do on the expenditure side. You also have to look at the revenue side. And obviously the state is not in a position, nor would it be responsible to request significant infusions in state aid. The state simply doesn't have the money for the next 2 years, and I don't think it's going to have the money for the next 5 to 7 years. And so you have to look at how you price municipal goods. And I know this is very politically unpopular, but you have to give more consideration to charges for services. And the one tax increase that I would look at very closely, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, the pandemic has brought to light, it's unmasked, tremendous savage inequalities that exist, income gap distribution, availability of essential services. And I think it's time to discuss the tax on the income tax on the top 1% of Rhode Island earners and earmark that money back to the communities to deal with some of the property tax and the school funding issues that I mentioned. There's no free lunch in this, and there's no easy choice, no good solution, but the solution is a combination of expenditure reductions and some revenue reforms. The last thing I'll mention is that the most important thing, and I'll do this quickly, is we need to retool how we deal with economic competitiveness. States compete to provide the most competitive environment, productive use rather, of their people, their natural resources, and their capital. In 2012, we restructured the way we did economic development. I think 2 years later, the governor proposed an array of different programs and incentives to encourage it. A lot of them worked. We made some progress. But in this environment, the use of certain kinds of tax incentives to build capital and other things that we were relying upon are probably pretty obsolete, excuse me. And so I think the pandemic really requires we think about how we compete and really with a focus on improving productivity and innovation. That's it.
Gary, thank you. No good choices. And the idea that everyone, towns, municipalities, the state, we're all in limbo is definitely an understatement. As we move into the second part of our panel discussion, Michael, I wanted to start with you to discuss the federal stimulus money. It still seems very vague as to how it can be spent, how it should be spent, who has oversight. Can you sort of dive into this for us?
Well, there's two parts to that question. The first part is the existing, stimulus money that's been passed, and quite frankly, the municipal officials that I speak with and outside of Rhode Island indicate that the federal government has done a very poor job giving guidance on how the money can be used, and that really has very direct impacts because we have to get money out there quickly. We have to build some confidence. The biggest problem we have right now in trying to turn this around is it's not the pandemic, but it's a lack of confidence. And the federal government has not, the way the federal government has administered these programs have not engendered confidence either by a government or by small business in trying to get access to some of the loan monies that are available. So I think the first thing is to clarify, as Paul mentioned, the $1.25 trillion federal subsidies that are available, and make it very clear that cities and towns, state primarily, has broad flexibility and use that money. It's kind of foolish to think that money is not fungible and that you can use it just to pay for pandemic expenses, but not recognize that toothpaste will go out of the tube somewhere else and you really haven't solved very much. So that's the first part. And that requires a much better administrative and policy practices by the federal government, because this administration's been a huge disappointment in that regard. The second point is recognizing that even if you have one-time money, this is a multi-year problem. If I'll just mention one figure as a sidetrack. When we entered the Great Recession in, I think, 2006, it wasn't until 2016 or 17 that we recovered all the jobs that we lost as a result of the Great Recession, 10 years. The state's own forecast that was discussed by their revenue estimating conference indicates that we're not going to have the same employment level that we had in February of this year until 2027. So we're looking at a multi-year period, so federal support can't be one time. It's great that the initial $1.25 trillion subsidy is there, immediate, got to do a better job on getting the money out. But the other legislation I mentioned, previous multi-year bills, and we have to look for federal support. It needs to be programmed, not for 7 years, that's fiscally impossible, but it certainly needs to be, programmed for 2 or 3 years to give the communities, cities and towns, the state some breathing room. The other issue is, and one that Congress and others have been grappling with, is how do you divide the money between the states and localities? That's always a problem. And I got to go back to the 70s when Richard Nixon did revenue sharing, the biggest fights were what was passed through money to the cities and what could the state keep. And we need to, that's why Senator Reed's bill is so strong, because he recognizes the service responsibilities between the state and cities and towns in distributing money. But that's going to have to be sorted out, or there's going to be a tremendous amount of inefficiency in any federal bailout program.
Michael DBAs, can I ask you to weigh in on this? If you were to put on your former hat as director of DOA, how should this money be spent?
Well, I should make the same disclaimer that Paul made, that I'm speaking on behalf of Rhode, not in the administration for sure. But I think, you know, Gary summed things up fairly well in terms of the relief fund and the 1.25 billion, but there's other money that's been coming in from the federal government. First of all, that 1.25 billion is relatively generous, and I give our congressional delegation a lot of credit. We got nearly 3 times what we would have received based on population because we got the minimum state share. But in terms of looking at how to spend that money, I think first and foremost, it should be used to respond to the public health emergency, and that's what the governor has been doing. She's spent about half of that money, or committed about half of that money already, the administration has, for things like personal protection equipment, testing, backup hospitals. So that's obviously the first priority. I think, you know, as I said before, we should be using the federal funding to meet the urgent essential needs of Rhode Islanders, which means filling the budget gaps to avoid cuts in essential services. But also we should be thinking about things like rental assistance and food insecurity and cash assistance. So I think we have to be a little bit more creative about what we're going to do with that money. And then we should look at that federal funding to help businesses survive, get back on their feet. And loans are not going to be enough. I mean, there's plenty of loans out there. There's a lot of business destruction going on right now, and we need to stop the bleeding. So I think we need to be creative about, and it's not easy. You don't want to throw good money after bad. But I think we need to think about, you know, how can we help businesses get over this hump right now? So this is a big, you know, we have a big budget deficit, but this is also a lot of federal money, and we're likely to get more federal money, as some people have talked about here. And we need to be strategic in how we spend it, not just fill holes in the way we want to or have historically wanted to spend money. We got to look more strategically at it.
So you mentioned the priority of making sure that the money is given to the people, but already we've seen some hiccups with the state systems of trying to get the money in the pockets of people in Rhode Island. Paul, I'm wondering if you could comment on the state's infrastructure, including the systems and the software across agencies who are either, yes, prepared to manage the increasing demand for the public services, or no, they are not. Oh, Paul, you're muted. Muted and maybe frozen. Can you hear me? There you go. Paul, can you comment on that? The state's infrastructure.
So I am not, this is Paul Dion. I'm not sure what the question was since you broke up.
Oh, let me repeat it for you. We're wondering about the state's infrastructure, including the systems and the software across the agencies. Are they prepared to handle this?
I apologize, but I cannot hear the question, Margie.
Can you hear me now talking? Let me try one more time. We're just wondering if we could have your take on whether the state's infrastructure, whether
I did just hear that.
Okay. Is the state ready to handle this? Oop. Paul, I'm going to move on. We'll come back to this question. Jeffrey, can we maybe move from the state into looking at the private sector and possibly how a public-private partnership can make things move along a little faster in Rhode Island?
I mean, there's a number of ways to think about that, public-private partnerships in terms of economic development. I mean, it has to be the case, and I would just speak to that, the role of the private sector working in concert with the public sector. And you can see it playing out in the response to the virus, right? So many of the healthcare providers, institutions, hospitals. These are privates. They're nonprofits, private. So they're working hand in hand with the public health officials and the governor's office to be very flexible and respond, expand capacity. So the public sector and the private sector are working hand in hand to respond to the immediate health issues. They're responding, private sector, the businesses across the state, they're responding to, and across the region are responding to the shutdown orders, and also actively engaged in the councils on the phased timing for reopening. So they're an active and fundamental partner in all of those conversations in all of the states across the region. Like, when is it safe to open? What sectors can and should open first? The phased approach that the different states have been taking. And in terms of moving forward, you know, even though this is a very different downturn, you know, essentially all of our economies fell off of a cliff because in some sense we froze them to save people's lives, and hoping that would be the best long-term option, and I think it is, but it will be starting back up in some sense. So the falling into the recession was a very different process, but the climbing back out may look and feel more like past recessions, in that we will have shut down sectors, and those workers in those sectors will have stopped spending money, leading to cascading downturns, and now the states and localities are deprived of revenues. So building back up is also going to require collaboration and partnership between the private and public sector in terms of identifying what those strategic areas of investment are. And every time you think about making your state a more hospitable place and an attractive place for people to stay, continue to do business, or maybe expand or potentially move to, you're always thinking about and always engaging the private sector at every step of the way, because the decision as to are people going to stay or potentially move to Rhode Island or any state in New England is it an attractive place for people? Is it an attractive place for businesses to operate? And so obviously for all those conversations, private households and the needs of private businesses are obviously going to be first and foremost in the conversation, and they obviously have to be part of the conversation in the policy-making rooms when those choices are made.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Paul, can you hear me? I was going to try one more time.
Yes, I can.
All right. So as we were talking about this, it really, you're hearing that the private corporations and companies have already helped the state, whether it was, you know, helping with software that was 3 decades old, or trying to implement a new system to get checks out on time. So let me ask you, do you think the state's infrastructure, the way it is right now, are you confident that they can deal with what we have in front of us?
Yes, I am confident that they can. Under Governor Raimondo, we have had quite a few upgrades in our, what were admittedly antiquated software systems that were used throughout the state. They haven't been, but and her ability to bring together private sector firms with expertise area to help us out with unemployment, for example, and pandemic unemployment assistance payments has really helped. And I do believe the state's infrastructure is in position.
Paul, we're finding that we have a pretty weak connection with you. I'm so sorry. You're just breaking up.
Okay.
I'm going to move on. We did want to save some time at the end of the program for some questions, and we're actually getting a lot from our participants. We're over 160 people joining us this morning. So again, good morning to all. I'm going to throw these questions out, and please feel free to jump in and then also add to some answers from other panelists. The first question is, assuming no federal aid is approved to offset the lost revenues in a timely fashion for this fiscal year, would it be worthy to consider a policy option that would include fiscal recovery bonds, 1 to 3 year terms, using the newly created municipal liquidity facility in order to address budget imbalances and avoid the drastic budget cuts that will only prolong a downturn? Feel free to jump in.
Margie, I would say no. I do actually think it's a good time for the state to borrow and invest, but to borrow to fund operating expenses is, I don't think is wise. I think, what we need to do is when you're in a hole, you got to stop digging. And we talked about an $800 million budget deficit. That includes the fact that the governor has proposed increasing spending by about $200 million for next year. So, I would respectfully submit that we begin by realizing that we cannot increase spending next year over the spending for this year. And I think that's how, we need to get at some of these, we do need to bring our spending under control. And that's going to be painful, but I don't agree with the borrowing for that purpose. I think we should borrow, but not for that purpose.
Can I just add one thing to what Mike said? We're talking about the problems brought about by the pandemic, and they're certainly very significant. But let's not lose sight of the fact that we had problems before the pandemic. We had a projected out-year deficit of over $200 million. This year's budget was not operationally balanced on the economic side. Our labor force and our growth in state gross product has been up, but it's lagged what's happening nationally. So we have really an opportunity, as Mike points out, in dealing with the problems that have become accentuated by the pandemic, to go back and recognize it wasn't peaches and cream for the state before the pandemic.
Michael, could I just ask you something to backtrack on something you had said earlier? You had talked about reoccurring expenditures. What does that mean exactly?
So that's basically our year-over-year spending rate for a household. That's kind of our rate of spending. So what I was just talking about now is the fact that we increase spending without actually doing anything. We have a school funding formula. We have certain tax reductions that are planned. We have healthcare expenses. So I'm talking about basically our regular rate of spending, and that it's a lot of this is automatic, so that the governor, even though in a time of a good economy where we have revenues going up, we think it's normal that the governor and the legislature face a big deficit in trying to solve the budget. When if you were a household and you got a raise each year, you wouldn't look at it that way. Now, some of those costs are unavoidable, healthcare spending and whatnot, but others we've kind of put into the budget, and we've kind of created these future spending commitments that we're going to have to reassess because we don't have that revenue, and I don't think it's coming back very quickly.
Before we get to the national picture one more time in this question, I did want to ask, prior to the pandemic, one of the priorities in Rhode Island was education. There were bills that were being moved. There were bills passed last year to really improve the education, trying to look at Massachusetts as a model. What happens with that?
Well, I think it's a very good question. And if you look at the big picture, our economic competitiveness is enhanced by the quality of our education system. if we want to be able to compete to rebuild this economy and attract people to stay here, to expand, to come, quality schools are very important. The lack of quality schools are adding to other social costs because there's savage inequalities that exist between some of our urban districts and others. And so in making those tough choices, you have to, and it's very difficult, assess what kind of spending really represents investments in the future, what kind of spending represents immediate return on investment for economic competitiveness. And education is one of those pictures. It would be a shame if we had to retreat very far from the education reforms that were made, and in the long term, it would prove to be very poor economic decision.
Margie, can I add to that? RIPAC has a very strong interest in education reform. The legislature last year adopted some important reforms around curriculum and other matters, but they left some unfinished business. And I think this year, even before the pandemic, there was a decision to allow the reforms that have been adopted to take root. But there's a lot more that needs to be done in education reform from a legislative point of view, and we need to get back to that. I think that the distance learning, which has to me been extremely impressive in how the educational establishment has responded, but it's not optimal, and it certainly was not optimal to the kids who are most needy and disadvantaged and have been left behind. So we need to get back to the urgency of improving our schools, and the pandemic unfortunately has set us back a bit, but we need to get, that needs to be at the top of our agenda as a state.
Jeffrey Thompson, let me ask you this next question. What is the chance Congress won't do anything else to support the economy? Won't they need to be perceived as addressing their state's needs to secure re-election? Love this question.
So that is a good question, and I'll happily kind of partly respond to it. But being a nonpartisan, non-political institution, there's only so much I can speak to that. I'm sure that the congressional delegations from every state do face a lot of pressure to act and continue to act. And obviously the discussion that we heard from my fellow panelists on some bills currently under consideration, there's enough conversation that you would just have to expect that something would happen. But there's also, we're seeing discussion of some pushback in terms of not everyone is as eager to pursue funding aid to the states in terms of to help the states address the budget gaps that they're facing. So there's differences of opinion. So will something happen? Probably something will happen. Exactly how big or how generous or how long-term it is, I have not one clue. But in terms of as long as unemployment remains at sustained high levels, if that is what we see happening, if we don't see a quick economic response from households just making calls and emails to their Congress people, you would expect continued pressure. So you'll see continued pressure for some sort of action. So I expect some additional actions will be taken. I don't have much to offer on what avenues those will take.
Michael, Gary, or Paul, would you want to weigh in on this one? Will Congress do more?
I think they will, and I would look for it in three areas. Something has to happen on state-local relations and finances, because as much as Mitch McConnell objects, it's as much a red state problem as a blue state problem, particularly for red states that have a less elastic tax system but don't have an income tax. So something will happen. I think on tax credits, you're going to see something new. There have been conversations of giving business a tax credit equal to 80% of the wages of their employees up to a certain amount. I think the last conversation I had was 45,000. And that can represent a middle ground between the president wanting to do something about the payroll tax and the Democrats wanted to expand unemployment insurance. So I'd look for a compromise on that. And the last issue that we haven't discussed, which is the question of liability. The Republicans really want a liability bill, and thinking particularly for small business, or thinking for businesses where there's a lot of human contact, it's something that will be addressed. So I don't want to handicap this thing, but I think something on state, local, something on a tax credit for business for keeping people, employed, and something on liability probably represent the three legs of some stool that's workable. The issue that I see is one of timing. Fiscal year ends end of June. I can remember when we did not adapt state budgets for petty political reasons, had nothing to do with anything important like the pandemic. So there'll be a timing question of how these decisions are made and how it affects the normal processes that state and local governments go through, not only in Rhode Island, but elsewhere, to make their fiscal decisions.
Michael, did you want to add? Paul? Well, let me ask you this then. Michael DeBiase, I'll start with you. It sounds like the budget will be extremely tight, deficit, deficit, deficit. And the person asking this question would like to hear from you on how you would cut, trim, or change our state to move forward.
Well, I think that, first of all, I expect there will be some more federal money, and I hope we get it because I think we need it. We need it to fill these budget gaps. The pain is too great, so I don't want to leave that impression. But I think, first of all, we need to not increase our spending for next year. We need to use our rainy day fund. That's what it's for. It is definitely raining. So we need to fill that budget gap. I do think that, government and government services are going to have to reinvent. We need to think about what services are most essential, and what, how different agencies can do things more efficiently. There is a limited amount of money here, so I'm not saying that it's easy, but we are going to need to tighten our belts. We haven't had to do that for a while, and I don't think any of the policymakers have had to. At least the leaders, I know a lot of folks in the legislature have, who went through the Great Recession, and certainly our municipal leaders have, but we haven't had a lot of austerity for the last several years, and we're going to have to deal with it now, and everyone's going to have to find a different way to get things done. The private sector is needing to do that. That's what's going on, and I think government's going to have to do the same thing.
So we had one more question. The guest noted that Rhode Island is a service-based economy and job losses are mounting in the service sector. I'd love to leave off on a positive note. Looking forward, where should we be investing our resources? Shifting the training and creating opportunities? Gary, do you want to start?
Well, I think there are 5 steps. The obvious answer is innovation. And part of the reason why our unemployment rate became the 4th worst in the United States in a 2-month period is that if you look back over the last 10 years, about 40% of the jobs we created, I think more than that, were in low wage positions. And they're easy to lay off and easy to let go. And so we have to look at improving the kind of work. And so it's an innovation in technology. The Commerce of Rhode Island has identified some of those opportunities. But the first thing we have to do is we have to make sure that we have a productivity agenda. And that I mean, to answer one very basic question, are we, as state policy, working with the private sector to have policies where we're utilizing our people and our capital and natural resources, because productivity drives economic growth, and that determines the state's standard of living, which we're suffering right now. Only productive enterprises create jobs. create wealth. And that starts, as I mentioned, with innovation, tying our programs to what they call the blue programs, being the ocean state and technology. And that essential to do that gets back to the question that you raised a few minutes ago, is that kind of agenda is driven by relentlessly improving public education and by creating private public sector situations where they could be complementary roles played by each sector. So I think it's not just, government doesn't do a very good job in picking out sectors. Every time government has picked out a sector, they've usually been wrong. And we have a whole history going back to the 70s and 80s of industrial strategies that we're going to be the best state in X industry. And we don't control too many things around us to be able to deliver on that. So it's really dealing with innovation, dealing with technology, and putting in place policies that would make the best use of what we have here. And then we will be able to compete. We're not competing for a specific industry. We're competing to have the most productive workforce, most productive use of capital, the most productive use of our tourism and natural resources. And if we make decisions to do that, the sectors will take care of themselves.
Jeffrey Thompson, if you were a betting man, where would you be putting your chips? What sectors right now?
Well, some of the things that Gary mentioned, I think, are very true in terms of focusing on innovation, the innovation economy and capacity. One thing I wanted to raise, like a parting thought I would have here, is there's that old saying, the best offense is a good defense. And if we sort of, instead of, if in looking forward, we also ground ourselves in where we are now, think about how different things could have been for Rhode Island, for any other state in the country or the region, if there was a dramatically improved public health capacity in terms of testing, PPE, prevention. And some of this obviously falls outside of any given state's purview. But in terms of a public health response, I'm not in the business of predicting future pandemics. I certainly didn't predict this one. But in terms of being prepared in advance could prevent you from having to take such a step back and having to shut down and being able to start more quickly. So that's potentially one area for state policymakers to think about, is like, how can we be better prepared if this kind of thing comes around again, so that we suffer less when we do stumble.
Paul, I hope that your connection is better. I'd love to hear your parting thoughts on where you would invest in the future.
Well, we'll give it a shot here. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Oh, I got lucky, I think. I think one of the things we need to consider is that even though we've had a service sector job loss, it has been very concentrated in leisure, hospitality, and accommodations. Other parts of the service sectors have been able to hold up. And I do think we need to leverage our higher education institutions better to fill out more of the professional, scientific, and technical services sectors. Right now, our services are very heavily weighted toward healthcare, education, and we could do better in the engineering, design, science, technology, and I think that's where we really need to diversify our economy at this point in time and focus our attention on generating returns in that area. Because to be honest with you, if you have those folks in place, you get the innovation, you get the productivity, all those things follow if you have that human capital, those people in place with those backgrounds who can execute those types of innovations and productivity enhancements.
Paul, I'm so glad we got you back. Michael, I wanted to ask you for your parting thoughts. In a year from now, which sectors will be shining in your eyes?
Oh, I want to build on what all the panelists talked about. And I also want to leave on an optimistic note, because I think we need to look, the state has an opportunity here. I mean, every crisis presents some opportunity, and the economy is not going to come back the same way. We don't know exactly how it's going to change, but we know that it's likely to be very different. I'm with Gary that we shouldn't be trying to pick the sectors and the types of businesses, but we do know that we're going to need a better prepared workforce. And so public education, both higher ed and K through 12, and also having our workers trained in these more technical skills that Paul talked about, more versatile skills, because they're going to change jobs. And having them just be able to be more productive and be able to help them, help grow wealth in the economy. I think that's what we have to get after as a state, and just realize that there's a lot of urgency and avoid just trying to refund the status quo, because obviously we got to maintain our safety net and other things, but I think that's a mistake. We need to prepare for the next set of challenges and not the last set of challenges.
Michael, thank you so much. And Jeffrey Thompson, Gary Sass, and Paul Dion, thank you for being part of this amazing panel. I think we covered a lot of ground today. As you heard, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. And I hope for the folks who joined us virtually that you found this informative and also maybe a little helpful as you navigate the weeks ahead. One thing I wanted to ask you to do now is to grab your calendars and enter Monday, June 8th. This is our third and last panel in this series. Bryant's incoming president, Ross Cattell, will host the final panel on jobs and sectoral changes. And again, that's 10 o'clock on Monday, June 8th. And just to give you a little teaser of who the panel will be, Scott Jensen, director of the Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training, Edinaldo Tubaldi, who you've already heard a little bit today. He's the professor of economics at Bryant University and also the architect of this panel discussion. Lori White, the president of the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce, and Dale Venturini, the president and CEO of the Rhode Island Hospitality Association. Your moderator will be John Kostreva, who is, of course, the former business editor for the Providence Journal and now adjunct professor of English and Cultural Studies at Bryant University. You can find all of the details online at the Bryant EDU page. And I wanted to thank you all for letting me be part of this amazing discussion today. I'm Margie O'Brien from Capital TV. I wish you all the best, and I think we just hit the sun coming out. So enjoy your day.